Hello and welcome to A Deeper Dive with me, Dara Cam. Today's special guest is former Senator Jeff Brandes, a St. Petersburg Republican who is now the founder and president of the Florida Policy Project. We're going to hear from him about what he wants the legislature to do to develop a long-term strategy on some major public policy issues. Join us for a deep dive into weed, criminal justice reform, housing, and much, much more.
And I would argue that in pretty much every area of policy outside of education, I could not, after 12 years in the legislature, define for you what the legislative strategy is long-term going forward. Can you?
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by City and State, Florida.
Really thrilled to have with us today's special guest, former Senator Jeff Brandes, a St. Petersburg Republican who is now the head of he's started and is the head of the Florida Policy Project. We'll hear more about that coming up. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's just dive right in. I will say that Senator Brandes is one of my OGs. You guys have heard me talk to my OGs a bunch. And that's because he has been involved as a legislator with several of the issues that I've covered over the years. One thing was you were an advocate for medical marijuana before medical marijuana was a cool thing. You also have advocated for criminal justice reform. We can talk about that. You also have been very active in the property insurance not biz, but issue, and that is something that your FPP has gotten involved in. So those are just a few of the things that you've been involved in. Let's start talking with your out of office following November. What's the one thing that you wish you had accomplished but were unable to do as a legislator?
Well, there's so many things that I kind of were on my sheet of kind of things I wanted to accomplish. It's hard to pick just one. I think the most frustrating area was probably criminal justice and prison reform, although it's by far the hardest area of public policy to work on in the legislature. And I think we've made significant progress in kind of softening my colleagues to working on that issue. But it's probably one of the areas of greatest need in the state of Florida, which is there's no vision for what they want to achieve, and there's really no champion right now on the Republican side for criminal justice and prison reform.
I am working right now. By the time this podcast is released, it will come out. I am working right now on a story about the mitigation efforts. We're in the middle of a tremendous heat wave in Florida. As you know, these facilities are, some of them ancient. I believe there is one, I can't remember offhand which one it is, one functioning prison that was originally built in 1913. It is still functioning. So most of the state-owned prisons don't have AC. It's quite hot for me just walking, just walking from the air-conditioned car to the air-conditioned house. So I've been working on a story about that. It's an issue that addressing prison reform and criminal justice reform has been a hard sell for Republicans because it makes some of them feel like it makes them weak to not be tough on crime. Am I right or am I wrong?
I think it depends on where you are in the country. Like I would argue that most of the major changes being done in criminal justice are being done by Republican governors and Republican legislatures around the country. It just hasn't hit Florida yet. And that Florida system is just different. Florida's system is largely driven by the sheriffs and the prosecutors. Mm-hmm. The sheriffs have a lot more strength here than they do in many states. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of a legacy of kind of how our state is set up. But also, there really hasn't been any vision or champion for kind of changing the system and showing people what it could be like. And so that was kind of the role I played when I was in the legislature. And I think we're kind of waiting for the next legislators to step up and play that role as well.
What about Amendment 4? That was the amendment that the voters approved a couple years ago that was intended to restore voting rights to felons who have served completed their sentences,
All terms of their sentences.
All terms of their sentences, excluding people who were murderers and sex offenders. So how do you feel about the way that that law has been implemented?
Well, I think the legislature got it right. I think the legislature, if you kind of go back and look at the historical record, you go back and look at the Supreme Court testimony, you go back and look at what the advocates for that, for Amendment 4 put out on their website and everything else, I think the legislative language captures the intent. And I think there's, I worked on that issue for years. I actually asked the Senate president to take that bill on because I thought I could do it in a fair fashion. And so
I think we need to tell our listeners that under the legislation you championed, they have to pay their fees and legal financial obligations, which is court fees and fines, in order to be considered to have completed their sentence.
And they have to complete, correct, they have to complete all terms of their sentence, which is, if you go back and watch the original Supreme Court briefing, exactly what their attorney said they had to do. Literally changed nothing from what their attorney, this is the advocates for Amendment 4, argued before the Supreme Court, and in addition put on their website and in their material and in certain editorials. So we kind of looked at the entire record and we proposed it. Now so I think the legislature got it right. Where I think it's gone off the rails is I think the Secretary of State's office has got it completely wrong. Right? The Secretary of State's office has done very little to help create an efficient process for individuals who have outstanding fines, fees, and costs to understand what those are. It's easy. It's probably pretty easy if you have a recent one in one jurisdiction. But if you have multiple felonies in multiple jurisdictions, it gets a lot more complicated. And especially if those were in the 70s or 80s, maybe early 90s, it takes some digging to find out what the true cost of everything is. And so there should be an efficient way for the state to deal with that. Even if they had started 2 or 3 years ago and said, hey, listen, on a go forward basis, we're actually going to have a full accounting of this at the state and a statewide level, and you'll be able to do that. And if you believe you've paid it off and in good faith have a receipt from the state, then we'll accept that as well. It's just hard to get all these things perfect. And that's where people can get tripped up, and that's not the right way to do it.
When they're getting arrested, some of them.
Correct. Right. Well, look, I mean, those were completely political. I mean, the amount of those have either been thrown out. One, prosecutor, the state now has said the prosecutor did not have the authority to do that. That's why they go back and change the law and give the statewide prosecutor the authority to arrest these individuals or to charge these individuals. Prior to that, they didn't even have the authority to do it. Most of these federal cases have settled for virtually nothing. I mean, just time served or, a small fine, whatever. Most of them have not led to anybody being prosecuted to the full extent or serving 5 years in prison for a felony. That has not happened, to my knowledge, to one of these individuals.
Yeah, the problem is, I wrote about the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition filed a lawsuit recently challenging the implementation of Amendment 4, and they are asking a judge to force the state to create a statewide database so that people can look up their status and find out, they're saying they're not getting these advisory opinions from the Secretary of State's office. What do you say? Do you think there should be a statewide database so people can?
Absolutely. Look, we've had years to put this in place. Look, the Constitution says you should provide a pathway for these individuals. We have failed to provide a pathway. We've provided resources, but they're under-resourced at the Secretary of State's level. And frankly, the Secretary of State, to my knowledge, hasn't asked for a lot more.
No.
So
they've asked for a lot more in the policing side.
Right. Well, right. They've asked for more there, but on the actually helping people comply with the law, that they haven't. And I've always been, listen, the first thing we should do is inform. The last thing we should do is arrest. And so how are we informing first and arresting last? Like, we should be working with these individuals who are trying to do the right thing.
Do you feel freer now to speak about some of these controversial issues or criticize people who
I
are
don't know
in
that I ever,
power?
at least for the last 4 or 5 years, I
Yeah.
felt, shackled to anything in the legislative process. I think I think you ultimately become a senator. You may be elected a senator, but there's a learning that takes place, and then there's a confidence that takes place in that role. And I think you ultimately become one. And you see people break out and embrace the role and embrace the honor they've been given in different ways. And ultimately, I think after I finished my last election, I realized, listen, this is it for me. But also, I have a voice now in a way that I really didn't before, or I didn't felt I did before.
I don't see a lot of independence. It used to be back in the day, and we had senators like Jim King and actually Jack Latvala, Greg Evers, some of those guys were more moderates. We don't see the Senate being as independent as it once was.
Well, I think you want to house train your pets. I'm not sure you want to house train your senators. I think that's the challenge. Is many of them are coming from the House, which is very top down. I always said that
that's going to be the quote that we're going to pull out quote. That's the
Yeah,
money
well,
quote.
I mean, I always said the House is like a military organization. It had its generals, its colonels, its captains, and its soldiers. And the Senate was, at least when I got into it, was like 40 Somalian warlords. You never kind of knew where things were going to line up. That there was kind of infighting factions in the Senate. And it was 40 Somalian warlords. It's a lot less like that now.
More
it's
boring.
much more houseified.
Yeah.
And I think that's doesn't serve the state of Florida well. And I think that's just a product of term limits. And frankly, term limits not being long enough. I'm somebody who fully supports term limits. I wouldn't have been in the legislature without term limits. But I think that the legislature, I think that this Constitution should extend the term limits for individuals, because it just takes so much time to learn this stuff.
You want to move on. I want to let you sort of guide what you want to talk about. We could talk about medical marijuana for an hour and a half.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about where we're at? How many years into this are we now? 6 years, 7 years into the state's medical marijuana? I'm betting I don't like to do predictions. I didn't used to like to do predictions, but now I'm an old lady and I'm resting on my laurels, and I am willing to make a prediction. I will do it right here, right now. I will say that I don't believe that the Florida Supreme Court will allow the adult use proposed constitutional amendment to get onto next year's ballot. What say you?
If I was betting, I would agree with you. I think they're going to have to tie themselves in pretzels to try to get it.
Like they did with Flora-Grown.
Well, even with Flora-Grown, they at least said, well, look, you didn't say that this didn't exempt the state from federal law, and because of that provision, we're going to throw it out. I mean, listen, these attorneys have had a year or two now to kind of sharpen their pencils and figure out go to the same conclusion. I think they're going to tie themselves in pretzels to try to do that. I mean, it's just going to be, they're really going to have to find some wild legal theory to say no to what should be a constitutionally sufficient ballot. And
I remember Kathy Jordan. I remember you walking around with Kathy Jordan. She's passed away since back in, this must have been probably 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. She came up here in her wheelchair and you were advocating for authorization. I guess I don't say legalization because it's still illegal under federal law, but you were advocating for authorization of medical marijuana for people with debilitating medical conditions. What made you take that up? What was the impetus for you championing that issue?
I would describe myself as a libertarian with a capital L and a Republican with a little R. And I'm not sure what all the Republican means right now, given the fact that some of the things that are going on in the legislature. But look, medical marijuana
they
was
want to be all up in your grill.
Well, the legislature never really knew what to do with me because I was like the odd bird, right? I always wanted smaller government than my Republican colleagues wanted, and they didn't know how to deal with that. And so, oftentimes I was voting no on things that they thought, that the leadership was pushing through. But look, we've totally messed up sports betting in the state. We've totally messed up medical marijuana in the state of Florida. I mean, it's like if a Republican, small government Republican, could design any of a worse system than Florida has, I'm not sure what it is. Where we make a handful of people extremely wealthy, we prohibit a vast majority of Floridians from being in the business. And when this was originally sold to us, it was supposed to be, hey, these are some Florida-based farmers. These guys have been growing daffodils and
Right.
coconut.
Bromeliads.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That was their business. And you know what? Now they're going to grow medical marijuana in a very controlled, and these families are going to continue this legacy. As soon as they got the licenses, they sold the shares of their underlying business and moved on and cashed out. And ultimately the big state firms came in, and that's who controls the business largely in Florida today. But it's not a great business in Florida because you have to be vertically integrated. But what it did is keep the rest of Floridians out of the business. So you and I, listen, if you can get in the business, great. There's just no pathway for you to be in the business.
Unless you're an attorney who specializes in regulated industries, or you have a huge chunk of change to invest.
It's about $40 million is what it costs to get in the business today. And you're 3 laps behind everybody else who's got all the other licenses and already has, is established in the state. So very difficult to be in that business today. But I'm just not a fan of the government prohibiting a vast majority, like 99.9% of the population, from engaging in an otherwise lawful activity.
It's a pain in the ass as a patient too. So I've done that, and I can tell you that none of the dates match up. The length of time that your card is good for, the amount of time that you have, and before you have to go see your doctor, the orders last a certain number of days, and none of it matches up. It's a pretty squirrely system that we've created, and it's quite spendy too. So we'll just
I mean, listen, it's just easier to get a card and then go to the street corner. It just is, and that's unfortunately the way that we.
Is it easier to get a card than go to the street corner? Because I'm not sure that it is.
To get a card, it's easier to get a card and then go to.
Oh, I thought you said that. Yeah, no, you're right.
Once you own it, nobody knows whether you're legal or not. The law enforcement really struggles to prosecute those. And so it just on the hassle basis and frankly supply basis, right? Like the companies are constantly running out.
Yeah.
Their products are never kind of stable. And so they have all kinds of supply chain issues. But this is what happens when people who've never actually run a business before start legislating a new business.
And they don't like it. I mean,
and they don't like it.
They never liked pot.
They create this most screwed up possible way that you can run a business. And, it's just fascinating to see how they've done it. And now even the guys that are in the business don't like it. Right. They want to be able to get away from vertical integration. They understand how challenging it is for them to run a business that's vertically integrated. They would love to have multiple suppliers. Listen, if we made McDonald's have to grow the cows and grow the wheat and grow the tomatoes, to make a hamburger and then, process it and then, transport it and then retail it. McDonald's wouldn't be in the business, and the hamburgers would cost 3 times as much.
Vertical integration is that they have to grow, process, and distribute the marijuana products themselves. They can't outsource it to anyone.
That's correct.
Yeah. So let's talk about one more thing before we talk about some of your new issues.
Sure.
I know you've spoken about this before, but colleagues asked them to give me some questions for you. The bill you sponsored in your last year in office to exempt parts of state college and university president searches has been used, shall we say, I'm reading this from a colleague, shall we say, creatively since its enactment. You've commented publicly. In fact, you spoke to my colleague, Ryan Daly, about that. Would you favor a repeal of that public records exemption now, or?
Given how it's being used and how it's been kind of weaponized, 100%, I would never have sponsored the bill had they been able to pick one person. That's why the bill says you shall make the final group, public, right? You shall make the final applicants public. So it specifically says in the bill that the final group of applicants has to be made public. Now, in my world, group is plural and applicants is plural. But from some strange reading, they have said, well, a group could be one person. and therefore we can just always pick our own person. Had I known that, had anybody ever told me that this could possibly happen, then I would have pulled the bill immediately.
Didn't
Because
critics at the time say that that's what was
no,
going to happen?
no, they weren't saying that at all. They were saying, look, we specifically, consistently said that. I said it. Then Senator Rodriguez, now Chancellor Rodriguez, said it. I mean, everybody was saying that, right? That the whole intent of this was to, if University of Florida got 150 applicants, right? That who cared who the 154th, 149th applicant was? Let's get to that final pool and let's get a better quality pool, because would you be willing to tell your current employer that you're out looking for a new job? That's what was happening. You were having, because everything was public record, it was basically like, the provost of Penn going in and say, listen, I'm going to go be I want to be the president of the University of Florida, but I've got to tell my current employer. So the legislature, again, should responsibly take this, that this was never the intent, that they should not be able to hand select whoever they want to be the president of these universities. There should be a process, because it diminishes the entire state when we do that. It diminishes transparency. It just makes everything look political. And that's not how university presidents should be hired.
You say it makes it look political. Is it political? I mean, it looks like it is political now.
It is. Well, no, it is political now.
Yeah.
Right. If we just pick one, and we can always pick one.
Right.
Listen, it happened once or twice, like in the entire history of Florida. Okay, everybody would say, oh, listen, this just happened. Not a big deal. But part of me is like, this is why we can't have nice things. Like, this is why when the legislature does these things, right? It wasn't the legislature's intent. Go back and read the bill's analysis. There's nothing in there that says we can select one always. But now we've had multiple times. And it's because the governor will take the broadest interpretation of the law that he possibly can and wait for somebody to challenge him.
We'll be right back with former Senator Jeff Brandes, president and founder of the Florida Policy Project.
Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara. It's interesting, you're somewhat criticizing the governor here. Your former chief of staff is now his chief of staff, or one of it.
Head of policy and budget.
Right, okay. So are you surprised at how Governor DeSantis is governing, or is this?
Well, I mean, I think you've always seen him kind of take the extremes, right? He always, and he won't back down from the extreme position. So I mean, I've always seen that. Right. And there's been times when we've agreed and there's been times when we disagreed. And I think there's a good DeSantis and a bad DeSantis. And frankly, it's a tough job. I don't expect anybody to get it perfect. But I think in this case, with this bill, I think that the administration has taken 100% the wrong position. And I think ultimately it will damage us in the future, because, in a few years, they're going to have to go back and get this public record renewed. And all the good work that we did to get this thing across the finish line will be for naught if there aren't a supermajority of Republicans in the House and a supermajority in the Senate, because there is no goodwill. There's no good faith here anymore.
Are you going to endorse anyone in the 2024 presidential?
Oh, I'm keeping my powder dry for a long time.
You keep your powder dry.
There's still a lot to go on.
I know. All right, let's go on to some of the issues that you care about right now, and not that you don't care about the issues that we spoke about. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about is, let's start with property insurance, and then let's go to housing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Florida Policy Project.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. Thank you. I'm sorry.
So my big takeaway after 12 years in the Florida legislature is this: everything in Tallahassee is tactical. On most issues, there's no strategy. We go year to year and we change policy without thinking about what is it that we actually want to achieve, right? Long term, what do we want to achieve? If we had 5-7 years ago said, listen, the goal for the property insurance industry is to encourage competition, to have low rates, and to have a robust market. right? If that's our strategy and we're going to build every bill to that, and if we aren't getting the outcomes that we want, we're going to change course, but ultimately that's our strategy, then we wouldn't be where we are today. We're paying 4 times the national average in property insurance. We would have, as a group, had a strategy that does that. Citizens wouldn't be at 1.4 million policies, which is where it's at today. It would be back around the 500,000 policy mark. But we don't have a strategy. Clearly, we have no strategy in criminal justice other than work. What's our strategy in housing? Housing obviously a major challenge in the state. What's our strategy in MCORS? I mean, in transportation, we're going to do MCORS 1 year. Now we're not going to do MCORS. Right. What is the strategy long term in transportation? And I would argue that in pretty much every area of policy outside of education, I could not, after 12 years in the legislature, define for you what the legislative strategy is long term going forward. Can you?
No, I'm thinking about it. No, I can't. I mean, we wanted to depopulate citizens, starting with property insurance. We wanted to depopulate citizens. So, no, I can't. So your goal with the Florida Policy Project.
So the goal of the Florida Policy Project is to say, listen, let's begin to look at some long-term strategies. And how are we going to get there? We're going to look at best practices from around the country.
But the problem isn't the problem that legislators want like the bright, shiny object so they can say, I did this, I did that, something that people like, for example, you get a refund on your tolls, for 6 months or whatever.
That's all little tactical stuff, right?
Right.
Why was education an outlier? Why was education the one area where we felt like we had a strategy? The strategy was always universal school choice, right? Why? And I would argue it's Jeb Bush.
It was
that
Jeb
Jeb came
Bush.
in,
Yep.
that started the Foundations for Florida Future, and he and Patricia Levesque for 2 decades carried that vision on. And that was the strategy for the state of Florida. And every year we chipped away trying to get towards that strategy. But there isn't a Jeb Bush in property insurance. There isn't one in criminal justice. There's definitely not one in housing. And so we have this kind of, Dr. Seuss push me, pull me going on, where every year, one Senate president could want one thing and the next Senate president could want the exact opposite thing. And and so we're making tactical moves like a schizophrenic who doesn't really have any long-term vision for where they want to go.
So you said that, you were an outlier. Your Republican colleagues didn't know what to do with you when you were in the legislature. So how receptive have they been to some of your, I don't know if you've made any specific proposals
So we're making specific proposals. So our 4 areas of policy that the Florida Policy Project focuses on is criminal justice, property insurance, transportation, and housing.
Right.
Just those 4 areas. I was never big into the healthcare space. Don't really know a lot about that space at all in the state of Florida, but there was a lot of others, people who are experts at that, not me. But in those 4 areas, I felt like I had some competency and recognized there wasn't really a strategy. And so what I was always focused on is, if we can just get to the best practice, like if we can just say, listen, Florida strategy is we're going to adopt the best practice. Then you go, well, where do you go for that? And I couldn't tell you. We have these fantastic tier 1 universities, research universities, University of Florida, FIU, Florida State, right? All these USF, right? These great tier 1 universities. What public policy comes out of those on an annual basis that informs the legislature on policy matters?
I don't know. I mean, we don't even use OPAGA anymore. The legislature's own analysts.
So we have these tier 1 research universities that actually do no public policy research that is presented to the legislature on a regular basis. So one of the things that the Florida Policy Project did was go out and start talking to them, find out who the experts are, find out their policy expertise, and engage them to identify the nationwide best practices in some of these problematic issues. And so we've got one report we've already done on housing. We just did one kind of on good governance.
Yeah.
And the next one's coming out on criminal justice, reentry, veterans, and elderly in the prison system. So, how can we produce these reports of best practices and then point our legislative colleagues in that direction? which is the goal of the Florida Policy Project, which is if we have, best practices will equal better outcomes, and which is what I want. So oftentimes policymakers talk about intent, like this is my intent. Your intent is all well and good. What is the outcome, right? What I'm focused in on is I want the best outcome, not the best intent.
Let's talk about, we know what the road to hell is paved with, right?
Look, the perfect case in point was my bill on the presidential searches.
Yeah.
Right? The intention was simply to shield people so that we would get more applicants until there was a final group. Right. And then here we have so that the governor can just select one. Right. So that's just shows you, intent versus outcomes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the housing because it's not something that we've discussed before. And I was looking at your report. I thought it was quite interesting that the Senate President Kathleen Passidomo, the Live Local, I think they spent $700 million or something on the Live Local, and that number could be wrong. So 100.
No, that's right. That's about right.
Yeah, on the Live Local legislation, and your report said, unfortunately, this bill barely addresses the tip of the affordable housing shortage iceberg. But first, let's examine the main problem, Florida's current zoning framework. And you're suggesting, and I thought this was quite interesting, higher density development. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how we make it so that people can afford to live here in Florida?
Sure. So my underlying premise is you're not going to solve this with money from Tallahassee. $700 million seems like a ton of money until you divide it by 67 counties. Mm. Right? And then you realize, well, each one of these counties is getting a little over $10 million a piece. And what are you going to do in Miami-Dade for $10 million for housing? Like, how many units could you really build for that when the unit would cost $300,000 to $400,000 a unit for an affordable unit, right? You're not building a ton of units, at least nothing that really moves the needle. And so my underlying argument is you're going to solve this with policy. You're going to have to put some dollars towards it too. But ultimately, if you don't get the policy right at the local level, then it doesn't matter how much manna from heaven comes down from Tallahassee, you're not going to solve the problem. And how do you solve it at the local level? Well, you got to get people to live in communities they want to live in. And how are you going to do that? Well, that's through accessory dwelling units. That's through smaller lot sizes. That's through upzoning. So you allow more density in urbanized areas. And that's the key that leads to everything else. Yes, you need more multifamily units, and Live Local largely focused on multifamily housing. And and I think it moves the needle a little bit in that direction. But without a broader kind of carrot and a stick approach to housing and forcing communities to actually come up with their own plans, then I don't think Live Local is going to work long term.
So we need to get out of suburbia.
Well, it's what you have to have is a buy-in, and this is the hard work that has to happen from your county commissioners and your city councils to utilize best practices to encourage more housing in densely populated areas. Like my community, St. Petersburg, they're probably going to build 100 new ADUs this year. Well, over time, that continues to grow. That's housing that's used just like an apartment's used, and it benefits everybody. And we don't have to go out and build some brand new, apartment complex. We're just adding basically a unit above somebody's garage for the most part.
So,
and that scale helps.
So if you are able to create affordable housing, if local level has to, like you say, have buy-in, let's talk about how people get insurance to cover those properties. What do people need to know that they don't know about the insurance crisis, and what do you think is the best approach? Because we've had special sessions, we've thrown billions of dollars at this issue just over the past less than 2 years, and every homeowner I know, myself included, who has a mortgage, and even those who don't, it's like a a crapshoot whether you're going to get
Yeah.
renewed or whether you're going to get canceled. Forget about even thinking of trying to file a claim for anything.
Right. So I think, one, this crisis was largely avoidable. And I think we have to be honest and admit that. Now, I don't think the legislature wants to do that, but back in 2017, 2018, they knew that there was the beginning of a problem. And what did the trial bar do? It said, listen, don't do anything. Just let it go another year. It'll fix itself. And every year it kind of got worse. And then it kind of metastasized. It started in South Florida with water claims and then a few roof claims. And then this combination of assignment of benefits, the one-way attorney's fees, the SIBO decision on concurrent causation, it was the perfect storm. And it ended up Florida being 8% of total U.S. property claims, and 80% of the nation's litigation was occurring in property insurance in Florida. So you can't be the most hurricane-prone state and the most litigious state and expect low property insurance rates. And that's the reason we lost, 12, 13, 14 carriers in the last 24 months. And it's not like we just lost them because they left. We lost some of them because they went bankrupt.
Sure.
And so the insurance industry as a whole lost $1 billion a year for the last 4 or 5 years. And, and investors have to backfill that. And that's a reason rates have skyrocketed. When you couple that with, the fact that the reinsurers, which is insurance for insurance companies, we're seeing large losses too, largely related to litigation. They got skittish on Florida and started to raise rates, which again is directly passed on to policyholders. And really, you can use Citizens Property Insurance as kind of the thermometer of the health of the state of Florida. If Citizens has a lot of policy in it, the health is really bad. And if Citizens has a few policies in it, well, then it's a pretty healthy market. But the market melted down because they couldn't raise rates fast enough to keep up with the litigation.
We had Tim Serio on a couple months ago, so I can send you a link to that. And listeners, I'll put a link to that out on Twitter so you can. Tim Serio had to say about the property insurance crisis in Florida. Do you think that the changes that the legislature has adopted over the past few years is going to stabilize the industry?
I do. I think you're going to start to see that stabilization in 2020, end of 2023, early 2024. I still think rates go up a little bit in that interim period. And then I think by 2025, you're going to see a bunch of new entrants in the state, right? And the effects of the law, which again was passed in December, but didn't take effect until April. So we're only, 3-4 months into it now? Right. And so my concern is that the legislature goes, well, things aren't happening fast enough. Let's undo it.
No, they're not going to do that.
Well, I mean, maybe not this next year,
right?
But we're going to have brand new leadership in 2 years.
Well, that's true,
right? And so I'm not willing to say that they're not going to undo it. I think that they would be foolish to undo it, and I think they actually need to build off of it more and give consumers more choice and encourage more competition and focus on bringing down the size and scope of Citizens and utilizing the CAT fund in a more way.
How do you give citizens more choice? I mean, property owners more choice.
Sure. For example, we could go to actual cash value roofs or stated value on roofs. We can carve up policies and make it a menu of options. Now the legislature and it kind of wants to play nanny here and say, oh, we can't do that. There'll be too many blue tarps. But it doesn't matter if there's a blue tarp in your house if you get foreclosed on because you can't afford the insurance.
Right.
So you've got to offer consumers more choice and allow them to tailor their policies to their pocketbook.
Like you can with your health insurance.
With your health insurance, with your car insurance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we give people lots of choices with their car insurance, but virtually very few choices with their homeowners.
That's interesting.
And so how can we offer more flexibility to let people design creative policies? And as long as they're meeting the standards of Fannie and Freddie, then the state should be okay with it.
Let's talk about criminal justice. You said you have a report coming up soon with criminal justice reform. So is there any ideas about that you'd like to share?
Well, I think one of the things that I bring that's unique to this is I know my audience, right? I know what was likely to work and what's likely not to work, right? And so we're not going to go out and talk, extreme sentencing reform or bail
Right.
reform. Where I
Cash
do think,
bail is a non-starter right
right.
there.
So where I do think we can have some success is in dealing with issues like veterans in prison. And what's the best practice for dealing with veterans? Elderly in prison, which is the best practice for dealing with elderly. Reentry, they're getting out anyways. How can we be more successful and have better outcomes with our reentering, the population that's reentering society? So, I think I bring that perspective of I know my audience, and I'm not going to design reports that are going to be way up on the tree when let's focus on the low hanging fruit first, because even that in the criminal justice space is hard.
Veterans is a good place to start because Republican leaders, state leaders, and legislative leaders, they heart veterans, right?
Yeah.
And you're a vet. You're a vet.
I am. So let's start there. Build trust. I mean, for me, how do I build trust with the sheriffs, the state attorneys, and know that what we're really focusing on is just coming up with the best practices. Like, we're going to tell you, here's the states that do it better than Florida, and here's why, and here's the outcomes that they get. And so why wouldn't you adopt if you're going to get better outcomes, why wouldn't you adopt that best practice?
Are you going to hire a team of lobbyists, or are you going to come up here and walk the halls yourself?
No, well, listen, I think we just educate and inform. I mean, we're a 501c3, so we can't do a lot of lobbying. What we can do is just inform the legislators that this is the best practice, and why don't you move there?
Are you having fun?
I'm having a blast. I really am, because I get to do all the fun stuff that I love doing, which is diving deep into some of these problems and coming up with solutions and building relationships around the state of Florida with universities. And ultimately, listen, I'm doing a lot of what OPAGA and frankly the state university should be doing. I'm just doing it in a foundation.
I miss OPAGA.
Oh, everybody, yeah. Well, most legislators don't know OPAGA exists, but it was a great organization back in its day.
Anything else that you'd like to talk about before we say bye-bye, and we'll catch you in a couple of months, see how your Florida policy project is playing out?
Look, I think I think there's kind of two types of legislators. I think there's the kind that want to be somebody, and there's the kind that want to do something. And I think oftentimes, even the ones who want to do something, they come in and they don't know where to start. They don't know who to trust, and they don't know what relationships to build. And so your first couple of years, you're just figuring that out. And in the House, it's just easier to just go along with leadership, even if they're 100% wrong, and they often are, right? That they just go along. So how do we build up legislators and identify legislators who want to do something, and then train them and arm them with the best ideas in the country? That's what all I'm trying to do. And they're not my ideas. I ask the questions. I don't come up with the answers, right? That's what the universities are doing, and that's what the experts that we bring on to help write these reports are kind of scouring the country and saying, here's where we can get the best practices so we can come up with better outcomes. Ultimately, what I would love to see is the state of Florida establish a strategy for each area of public policy. If it would just do that, and that strategy would go for multiple years, if it would just agree on a strategy, then we would be much better off as a state.
Former Senator Jeff Brandes, the founder and president of the Florida Policy Project. Get a plan, get a strategy, and stick with it, legislature. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator. You're once a senator, always a senator to me. So thanks for joining us. I can't wait to have you back.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. Talk to you soon.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is a podcast by City and State Florida, hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs LLC and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.